Bet the Board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Fuhrman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast, powered by FanDuel. College football on the docket today, and while I'd like to claim I knew what week it actually was, I'm not quite sure any of us do in this topsy-turvy college football season, but that won't stop us from breaking down some of the biggest games on the schedule, and we do have a bevy to get to. I'm your host, Todd Fuhrman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider.
I believe the experts are calling it week 5 of the college football season.
Should we be going off of when we actually saw week 1 games? I mean, Labor Day weekend, technically the college football kickoff weekend, or do we go by the SEC calendar? Do we hit reset when the Big Ten gets going? I mean, I'm honestly not sure how to classify week by week.
I never classify it. I just look at the odds screen, go by rotation. Every day in week feels the same in this life.
Boy, that sounded extremely uplifting. And just to think, we only have 4 games to get through and an updated top 10, and we're getting started on such a positive note. Thank you, Payne, for setting the tone for this particular podcast.
Let's get it.
All right. What you want to do games? You want to talk updated top 10? Where should you think we should start today?
I don't care what we do. I mean, I don't know if we need to go through the top 10, but maybe what we saw this past weekend.
All right, let's do that then. Let's do that then. And as we did last week, we got very positive. Or I could just
go through the top 10 and throw it on your plate. Either way, I don't know.
All right. Well, if you want to do that, you can rattle off the top 10. We can talk about underrated and overrated, because I know you're going to want to spend a lot of time on the overrated team. And then, of course, we'll get into the 4 biggest games. And for those folks scoring at home, Oklahoma at Iowa State, Texas hosting TCU, little Georgia Auburn, and Texas A&M against Alabama. But Payne, without further ado, the revised Bet the Board top 10.
By the way, I have to look this up, although I know part of it off the top of my head. I'm pulling up the Excel sheet now, but Ohio State's still number 1. That's right, they didn't play this weekend.
A big opening game for Ohio State. Going to be tough for them to fall out of the number 1 spot, at least I would think, without playing a football game.
Yes, absolutely. There you go.
You want to go.
Is that it? Were you going to talk about them?
Well,
no.
I mean, what else do you want me to add? We talked about Ohio State last week. Nothing has changed for the Buckeyes. You know what? Nothing has really changed for the first 2 teams, because Clemson, who you have number 2, is also coming off of a bye. Do you want to deep dive the Tigers while I have you?
You know who did play? My number 3 team, Alabama.
Payne? Yeah, Alabama did play, and for anybody that watched against Missouri, the Crimson Tide did what we thought they would do. They built a 28-3 lead in the first half. Mac Jones tossed 2 touchdown passes to Jalen Waddle. We'll get a little bit more into Alabama later for their showdown against Texas A&M this weekend. But I think, hey, look, this is a team that's going to have to figure some things out defensively. I know there are a lot of folks that laid the 4 touchdowns with Alabama that were really unhappy with the way things transpired late, but let's just judge them off the first half. A very worthy number 3 team, at least thus far.
Georgia, number 4, did not move, even though it was a shaky start with Dwan Mathis.
I kind of want to hold back on Georgia, because I think it'll become readily apparent how we feel about the Bulldogs and what some of our expectations are as we begin to set up their, one of the oldest rivalries in the South when they play host to Auburn. So I'm going to hold back some thoughts on Georgia for now.
Kyle Trask in the Gators, number 5 still.
Do you want to give Florida credit for their offensive explosion, or was that more a reflection, in your opinion, of Ole Miss being absolutely pathetic in terms of doing anything to stop the run of the pass?
A little bit of both, and I'm kicking myself in the butt for not playing that over. And I'm not playing Monday morning quarterback here, but we divulged a nugget informationally that not many people had in regards to Ole Miss's defense last week, and how their defensive starters could only handle about 50% of the snaps in the final scrimmage because they were gassed, and that was on full display, along with being horrific. So not playing that over is just something that's been eating at me since Saturday.
So when you have no talent and you have no conditioning, that's not exactly a recipe for success. I'm going to mark that down on my little notepad right here.
Let me ask you this, though.
Going forward. Sure, fire away.
Wasn't in love with what I saw from Florida's defense. Now, I know there wasn't a lot on film of what this version of Ole Miss would do. We talked about two key cogs not being there for Florida. Another one gets bounced out after a targeting call. The secondary looked like it had some question marks.
I'm curious to see what we get from Florida this week. And I know they're major favorites against South Carolina, but can the defense be better? Because they'll at least have a 60-minute sample size of what Will Muschamp has offensively. Meanwhile, I'm not going to throw them under the bus for how they performed against Ole Miss because the Rebels do have a little bit of an element of surprise. I mean, you were spot on in terms of who their starting quarterback was going to be, and he actually looked good for flashes. So I don't want to try and say that Florida's defense is going to be their Achilles heel this season, but I definitely want to see market improvement from week 1 to week 2.
Absolutely. We'll go in order here. We can rapid fire these. Penn State, Notre Dame, Wisconsin. Nothing changed. 6, 7, and 8.
Hold on a second. Something may have changed for number 7. We're not quite sure when Notre Dame's actually going to get all of their players out of COVID protocol. So as you look at the Irish going forward, if they continue to have 18 guys in isolation and quarantine, I'm not quite sure what's going on in South Bend, but that's a lid I'm not taking off Pandora's box because I'm never going to be able to get it back on.
So you think Notre Dame shouldn't be 7?
No, I think Notre Dame, if they have their full complement of players, is extremely talented and the biggest threat to Clemson in the ACC. But I'm a little bit concerned about the players, the discipline, and while you don't ever want to say, it's a direct reflection of what's going on within the program, but when you continue to have these outbreaks, somewhere along the way, somebody has to take responsibility, and I'm not sure if it falls on Brian Kelly and the rest of the coaching staff or the players and what they've been doing in their spare time.
And it's been going on throughout. I know a lot of people are just forward-facing right now, hearing about this or seeing it after the last couple of weeks, but this has kind of been an issue in camp as well. Number 9 is a team you might have to do a little explaining about, is the Texas Longhorns. I kept them in the top 10. It did not look very good.
No, they did not look very good. And that was one of the more bizarre games of the entire weekend, because if you look at the final score at 63-56, you're going to think it was this massive offensive explosion where defenses couldn't get stops. Payne, neither Texas nor Texas Tech averaged more than 5 yards per play. You're not supposed to be able to score 119 points in a game when you have that going on. Texas lacked some pop in the vertical passing game. I don't think their offense was nearly as good as the 63-point outburst. I don't think their defense was nearly as bad as the 56 they gave up. But when you want to talk about mediocre to poorly played college football games, that may be the poster child, because it felt like every time I picked my head up, one of these teams had the ball in plus territory and had to go about 35 yards to try and score a touchdown. But there's no doubt right now, Texas did not look like a top 10 team. Let's see what they were able to sort out on both sides of the ball, because I think they have a little bit of a sneaky test this weekend against an in-state rival that's really owned them of late, a game that we'll break down in greater detail when they play host to TCU.
My memory is dog crap, but I am nearly certain. I was looking at an Excel sheet the other day, and the average starting field position for Texas in that game was the 39, and it was the 38 for Texas Tech. So you're spot on with the drive distances there. Number 10 is interesting, and I hate to do this because I don't feel like they outplayed Kentucky, but I'm going with Auburn, and based upon just our metrics, Auburn got a boost up because we were so high on Kentucky that the strength of schedule kind of forced it up here into the top 10. Now, again, they're hanging on by a thread, the Auburn Tigers, in my top 10, just fractionally ahead of a few other schools that may end up falling into this. Now, I want to say something here. Our boy Rome, who's a loyal listener of the Bet the Board podcast, said we hyped the crap out of Kentucky, all for naught. So 2 things I want out of you. Tell me what you saw in the Auburn-Kentucky game, because I don't think the final score was really indicative of what happened. And do you think Auburn's a top 10 team?
I do not think Auburn is a top 10 team from what I saw right now. We talked about it going in, that we thought Chad Morris could give them a fresh spin on the way things were going to look offensively. But some of our fears for Auburn were realized. There was no pop whatsoever in the ground game. Bo Nix looked semi-erratic. He was bailed out by, his veteran receivers. He does have a talented trio there that I think are going to match some of their deficiencies. It was a game that I think takes on a very different look and feel if Terry Wilson doesn't get intercepted going in for the momentum score to give Kentucky a lead going into the break. And when you look at Auburn, we'll talk about some of their metrics from that performance, but let's just say they were very efficient when it came to their scoring opportunities. And when you go up against that upper echelon of SEC defenses, you need to put yourself in a position to score points on a lot more drives than Auburn did. You can't bank on getting 7 every time you get into plus territory. And when you look at the Tigers, they had 2 touchdown drives that went the length of the field, and they had 2 on shorter fields. I'm very curious to see how they fare this weekend against a much better Georgia defense. But for me right now, I think Auburn is lucky to be inside the top 10 here. I think there's going to be plenty of opportunity to bet against them.
I agree. It was tough to do. Again, more of a strength of schedule boost because they beat a Kentucky team that we were really high on. And you're spot on. It was tough to do it because Kentucky outgained Auburn. They out first down Auburn. All the metrics pointed in Kentucky's favor. The touchdown before the half that wasn't absolutely ridiculous. I don't know where the replay was on that. And it changes the momentum of the entire game. These are 18-year-old kids, right? Super emotional still. If you get that momentum score going into the locker room, it's worth more than the 7 points on the board. I truly believe that. Terry Wilson still looked like there was some rust on there, a key fumble in the third quarter around midfield that changed the complexion of things. Auburn didn't have the ground game going, as you alluded to. And I believe 2 of those touchdown drives required some third down magic on the actual touchdown. So I'm not convinced of my own power ratings here, slipping Auburn in there. But I will say this. I feel a little bit better because I got some nasty emails about how I was an effing idiot that I didn't have LSU or Oklahoma in the top 10. So I feel a little bit better about that.
I was going to say anybody who watched either of those 2 teams last week begins to realize exactly why you're the best at what you do in terms of compiling these numbers. Sure, Oklahoma had a 3-touchdown lead, but you saw the youth and inexperience of Spencer Rattler. You saw the offensive line really look to be a few steps behind what we've grown accustomed to from Oklahoma. And in crunch time, we'll talk again more about the Sooners. There just was nothing on the offensive side to speak of. And maybe for the first time since taking over as a head coach in Norman, Lincoln Riley had a very questionable decision late in the game. But I want to save that for when we break down Oklahoma and Iowa State. As far as LSU, Payne, this team looked like a shell of its former self. And we can point fingers at quarterback. We can point the finger at skill position talent, defections. They were ill-equipped to do anything on either side of the ball. And we can say what we want about the first time you play a Mike Leach offense. Mississippi State did exactly what Mike Leach has done for the last handful of years at Washington State, for all of his time at Texas Tech. It looked like LSU did nothing to try and prepare, and maybe that's partly because they just didn't have the athletes or some of the players to match up against Mississippi State and KJ Costello.
Mike Leach put everyone on high alert that his offense is not to be taken lightly, and regardless of what we think of LSU, setting an SEC record in your first game in the conference with a shortened offseason, you have a transfer quarterback that didn't have a lot of rapport with his receivers. It's ridiculous when you think about all the circumstances pulling against Mike Leach there. Now, I think those that thought it was a hot take not to have LSU in the top 10 saw what we saw firsthand here. Now, I get it's a 60-minute sample size, but when you lose 14 NFL players that were drafted, another in Jamar Chase opting out, that's going to be a top 10 pick come, April. This is ugly. And I know the media falls in love with this saying, Todd, that we always hear, reload, not rebuild, when it comes to these elite programs. But roughly 50% of 5-star kids actually get drafted. So to have 15 guys from last year's team that will be drafted is nuts. And they're quality players, right? Like, it's obvious, right? Joe Burrow, the number 1 pick, he's good. But he's a day 1 NFL starter. Edwards-Helaire is a day 1 starter and a monster contributor for a prolific Chiefs offense that won a Super Bowl. Patrick Queen, day 1 starter. I want to say this, it doesn't appear this way after Monday night, but Baltimore's a good defense. He's a day 1 starter. These weren't just guys. These were elite players. And then you lose 2 premium coordinators in Dave Aranda and Joe Brady. So, you're not just downgrading both sides of the ball talent-wise, but the coaching regresses substantially, and the replacements are trying to implement new things in a shortened offseason. This isn't hyperbole. I checked this morning, Todd. We make last year's LSU team a 29-point favorite over this year's LSU team if they played this weekend.
And I think anyone who watched that game last weekend would be hard-pressed to argue with you. Now, I do have to be honest with our listeners here. You and I debated two very different angles in that particular football game. We debated Mississippi State, didn't bet the dogs in that spot. And with the injury or the announcement that Derek Stingley wasn't going to play and no move on the total, we debated going over the total as well on game day. We thought we were geniuses by passing when it was 3-0 at the end of the first quarter. By the time that they had scored 70-plus points, I was ready to bang my head through the damn desk.
Oh, I remember that. I was thinking, man, we evaded a landmine here. It's 3-0, and then the pick six happened, and that just opened the floodgates.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how Mississippi State fares as there's more tape, how they elect to handle prosperity. Not a game we're going to get to, but I think it'll be fascinating when you go from being a 16.5-point dog, closing as a 14-point pup, and winning outright against the defending national champs. The following week against an SEC West rival, you now are more than a 2-touchdown favorite against Arkansas. Let's see, because if there's a head coach in college football that can upset teams, it may be Mike Leach. If there's a head coach that might not get his team prepared the following week with a target on their back, it could also be Mike Leach, given the hype video we saw. So let's see what goes on in Starkville. For all those Mississippi State Bulldog fans that are out there, don't start punching your tickets to the national championship just yet. Which I think, Payne, provides the perfect opportunity for us to segue into our first game on the slate this weekend for a team that may have had their national championship aspirations officially punctured by losing to Kansas State last weekend. That, of course, being the Oklahoma Sooners, who go on the road to Jack Trice Stadium in lovely Ames, Iowa, to take on the Iowa State Cyclones. And you're looking at Oklahoma, a 7.5-point favorite. Total in this game is 63.5 at FanDuel. And before we get into some of the X's and O's, I think it's interesting to consider that Oklahoma, over its last 20 conference games, just 7-13 against the number. But what's crazy about that, the Sooners are 34-0, 23-10-1 against the number, coming off a straight-up regular season loss. But your man crush, Matt Campbell, has really had their number. He's covered all 4 games as Iowa State's head coach, albeit as double-digit underdogs against the Sooners. Something has to give this weekend, and we may as well start with the number, which I can tell you, nobody in their right mind had this game power-rated Oklahoma minus 7.5 before the season started.
By the way, my phone's ringing. Tyrod Taylor is on line 3. He's not happy with how you introduced that game. I believe you said something about puncturing.
I did, and I have to be a little more sensitive and cognizant of what's going on around the football world these days. But the air may have come out of the room, but thankfully it wasn't a Sooners player's lung.
There you go. The number is interesting because, we saw immediate money come in this week. And they were taking a number that certainly didn't align with where we have this game power right now. It's not substantial. I wasn't high on Oklahoma, as our listeners know, but did make the game 10. So it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. I know one shop opened this 10.5, got immediate money. The rest of the market opened 8.5. I did see professional money come in on Iowa State at that number. We'll see where this continues to trend and ultimately what ends up being the side. I think there's going to have to be a difference of opinion if groups can lay under a touchdown here. But at 7, I don't really have a feel for this one either way.
All right, well, should we not preview the game, or how do you want to go about it?
No, I mean, let's talk about which side of the ball. You lead us in the direction. I thought you just want to talk about the number initially.
I'm busting balls because I do think the number stuff is fascinating. It always begs the question in college football, how much do you adhere to your power numbers after you see a couple of data points? Do you make those wholesale changes? Because we know that things can shift a lot more quickly in college than they can in the NFL, where you have a pretty good baseline. But let's talk about
this week. I have to tell you, this was one of the weeks where we've made the most drastic adjustments that we have done. I talked about this on the NFL podcast, saying, hey, from week 1 to week 2, at a time where we're always saying don't overreact to a 60-minute sample size, that I anticipated us on the NFL side making some larger adjustments. With college football, it seemed to be even larger. Oklahoma really, really took another step back in our power numbers. LSU took another step back in our power numbers. I was still stunned to see how much, listen, you don't want to overreact to what we saw from Oklahoma. They looked good for 2.5, 3 quarters, but part of the issues I thought they were going to have coming into the season certainly showed itself in game 1, and we downgraded Oklahoma off that. So the number is certainly interesting, but we can break down each side of the ball here against Iowa State and try to break this down. Hopefully we provide an angle that gives someone else, maybe pushes them over the top. And I do think this becomes a different debate if this gets under a touchdown. I might almost feel forced to dabble on Oklahoma if we get this under the key number 7.
And I think the biggest question, when you look at Oklahoma's offense, that obviously has been their calling card under Lincoln Riley. We knew when you get a couple of transfer quarterbacks coming in and Kyler Murray and Jalen Hurts, you're going to be able to be a little bit more creative, so to speak, with your playbook in terms of what those guys had been exposed to before inheriting his offensive scheme. Spencer Rattler, probably more talented as a pure passer than either of those guys, but just didn't have the college reps. And, it sounds cliche and the pun's not really intended. I think the big thing for Iowa State defensively, in his first true road game, it's all about rattling Spencer Rattler, getting him off of his spot, trying to create a crisis in confidence, so to speak, knowing that he's got a little bit of a gunslinger's mentality. He's going to try and make some head-scratching plays that are going to be good and that are going to be a little bit problematic. And when I look at Iowa State, defensively, Payne, they've been good through the first couple of games. They've been good against the run, holding both their opponents to, less than 3 yards per carry. They held TCU well under that number. But the issue that I saw with the Cyclones, they allowed TCU to convert almost half of their third downs. And there were a lot more busted coverages in the secondary than we've grown accustomed to from a Matt Campbell-led defense.
So you hit everything perfectly. And, I think Spencer Rattler is obviously going to be a pretty good quarterback. He's a 5-star kid. And I'll say some things that probably you didn't want to say. It's the mental side. It's the leadership aspect. It's the maturity that I think will determine if Rattler can go from being super talented to an elite quarterback. You can't question his arm. He's mobile. The accuracy through 2 games this season has been off the charts, 20% above expectation, but he crumbled under pressure in the fourth quarter against Kansas State. Oklahoma's offense averaged 3.4 yards per play in the fourth quarter. They had a 27% success rate. When the moment was biggest, Rattler shrunk a little bit. Now, you mentioned kind of playing within the offense. And for people listening, Todd and I don't compare notes before these podcasts. It's pretty wild. But he saw the same things I've seen. And again, it's just a 2-game sample size, so I don't want to make too much of this, but I started digging into Rattler's release tendencies after I heard Lincoln Riley say that he wants Rattler to play a little more within the offense. And again, small sample size, but it indicates that Rattler has been literally unstoppable when the ball comes out on time and within the parameters of the offense. But when Rattler holds on to the ball and decides to improvise a little bit, that's when he gets himself into trouble. So when Spencer Rattler releases the ball, within 2.5 seconds or quicker, he's completing 86% of his passes, 126 passer rating, and more importantly, Todd, no interceptions. When Rattler holds onto the ball, pats it a little bit, and releases after 2.5 seconds when he's improvising, passer rating dips 16 points, completion percentage 17% lower, and all 3 of Rattler's interceptions this season has come when he has released the ball after 2.5 seconds. And I think that's important because you hinted that this, Iowa State defensive line is pretty good. I'm not sure Oklahoma's offensive line is. K-State's defensive line last week, it's not going to be confused with the 85 Bears, but they pressured Rattler on 38% of his dropbacks. This is a Wildcats defense that was 121 in the country last year in passing down sack rate. When I look at Iowa State's defensive line, this appears to be the strength of the defense. Jaquan Bailey, that dude's playing possessed right now. And I know Downing wasn't the mobile of the 2 quarterbacks, but he was pressured on 41% of his dropbacks. So I think it's even more important that Rattler gets the ball out on time here. Don't make that big mistake. I think it's okay to even, eat it on first down, throw it away, maybe even take the sack. You mentioned third downs. That's something that I dug into as well. I know success rate has this luck element to it on third down. But even last season, Iowa State's defense, 94th in the country in defensive third down success rate. They returned basically everyone, upgraded in some certain areas in the secondary. But against TCU, the problems continued on third down. TCU's average distance to go on third down was 10.4 yards, and somehow the Frogs had a 50% success rate on third down. So there's something, schematically going on with that Cyclones third down defense. So to me, again, worst case situation in this matchup, it's okay if you're Rattler to face third down in medium or even long. It doesn't mean the drive is over. Don't force a ball on first or second down that isn't there. If Rattler can be, kept upright, and I think he gets the ball out on time within the confines of the offense, doesn't make the mistakes, the Sooners are going to move the ball here, Todd. And I went back, and I know you watched in real time, but I saw the condensed version. Cyclone secondary struggling right now. They have issues defending the seam for some reason. You're hoping that Matt Campbell gets that cleaned up. The tackling was absolutely horrific from the secondary. So we need to see a bounce back from the Cyclone secondary. They're going to need it because Oklahoma's offense can be a little pissed off this week. Again, money's poured in on Iowa State at a number lower than what it would have been last week because Oklahoma looked terrible. But this is typically a spot where Oklahoma's bounced back off a loss, Todd.
Going to be interesting because Oklahoma, at least for me watching them, has a ground game that really lacks pop and explosive abilities. And you mentioned Kansas State and some of their shortcomings. This was a team on Friday that had been ravaged by COVID. We weren't quite sure what Kansas State was able to even bring as far as depth was concerned, but they got stronger as the game went on. McGowan and Pledger, not exactly Trey Sermon and Kennedy Brooks by any stretch of the imagination. So I think Lincoln's going to have to put Rattler in positions to throw early on. Meanwhile, Payne, on the other side of the ball, Iowa State, I don't even know how to wrap my head around what I've seen from them offensively. Against Louisiana, they were downright dreadful. Against TCU, sure, you scored 37 points, but there were a lot of problems. And when you have a veteran quarterback like Brock Purdy, you expect it to be a little more fluid. 249 of the Cyclones' 423 yards of offense came on just 5 plays. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you can't consistently string together 6 to 8 play drives and that all 4 of your touchdown drives are going to come, or 5 touchdown drives, come on drives of 6 plays or less, Iowa State isn't the Oregon Ducks under Chip Kelly.
Listen, when I dug into this side and you kind of hinted at this, I came away thinking that there's a ton of variance here. Right, that this side of the ball is a little tougher to uncover what might actually happen. Are we going to get the Sooners defense that showed up in the first half against K-State, where they were actually outstanding? They held the Wildcats to 2 yards per play in the first quarter and a 17% success rate, followed it up in the second quarter, allowing a 33% success rate. Or are we going to get the second half defense? I thought Oklahoma did a nice job getting after Skylar Thompson, pressured him on 41% of his dropbacks. But the Sooners couldn't actually finish the play. So they're also losing some playmakers along the defensive line and in the front 7. The 41% pressure rate turned into just a 12% sack rate. And you have to question the caliber of opponent. K-State was replacing all 5 starters from the 2019 offensive line in a shortened offseason at a position that relies on chemistry and continuity arguably more than any. Iowa State's offensive line is going to be significantly better. Where the other element of variance comes in here, Todd, is, and you nailed this, is the play of Brock Purdy. It hasn't been to a level that I think either of us projected, and frankly, Purdy's play has been below where he ended both his freshman and sophomore seasons. That interception that was ruled a fumble is the most ridiculous thing I think I've seen from a quarterback.
I was going to say, I wish I could create a visual for all of our listeners that didn't see that play. I thought I was missing something when I saw that in real time. I had to stop, go back and watch it multiple times to figure out what the hell that was.
It was the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. And then all of a sudden the night game came and my beloved Florida State Seminoles had a similar play. So I was like, oh, okay. But when I was looking at Brock Purdy, you're thinking he's coming into his junior season. You're expecting this monster leap. And right now, whether he's been under pressure, which isn't often because the O-line's actually playing pretty well, or Purdy's throwing from a clean pocket, the performance is down across the board. Just a 47 passer rating, completing 38% of his throws under duress, 83 passer rating with a perfectly clean pocket for Brock Purdy. You have to wonder if some of this is on the receiver group. Alan Lazard and Akeem Butler, not walking through the door. You had Jones and Petway graduate last season. To the naked eye, when I went back and watched this, it doesn't look like there's a lot of separation from Iowa State's receivers right now. And the one thing that sticks out in my mind, Todd, is remembering what Billy Napier had to say. Louisiana Lafayette's coach said after beating Iowa State that he felt comfortable playing their corners in man and in press situations because he didn't think Lafayette was going to be out-athleted by the Cyclones receivers, and it allowed the Raging Cajuns to play more guys in the box. Let's see if that's something that Alex Grinch tries to employ here, although I don't know if he has the horses in the secondary to do that, but I think that might be the right strategy. The other thing that we're seeing from the Sooners defense was just really lackluster performance there in the second half against K-State. I know Alex Grinch is our kind of man-crush guy, but his defense got roasted in the second half. Gave up 13.7 yards per play in the third quarter alone, 7.8 yards per play for the entire game. That's nearly 2.5 yards more than the national average the Sooners defense gave up against K-State. We saw this massive leap last year, right? The Sooners defense went from 84th in defensive efficiency to 36 in Grinch's first year in Norman. Obviously, there wasn't going to be that large of a jump again this season, but I anticipated another small tick up. And so I'm not quite sure what we're going to see because I'm surprised with how the Sooners defense looked. I'm surprised with how Brock Purdy's performed so far to this point in the season. There is a ton of variance on this side of the ball, Todd.
Yeah, and if you're Oklahoma and you're prepping to take away one thing Iowa State does, eliminate Breece Hall, given what we've seen so far, make Iowa State beat you through their passing game. And we'll figure out which one of these teams is an actual contender for the Big 12 Conference Championship this year or which team will go down as a pretender. Should be one hell of a game from Ames on Saturday. Staying in the Big 12, though, Payne, we'll go down to lovely Austin, Texas, where the Longhorns will welcome an in-state rival, TCU. You're looking at Texas, an 11.5-point favorite now. Total in this game, 62.5. And as we record here on Wednesday morning, you did see some money come in on the road underdog late last evening. The 13s in the market no longer out there. You look at recent history between these familiar foes. TCU has owned the series of late, winning 5 of 6. Thank you last year, Horned Frogs, for getting us and our loyal Bet the Board listeners to the window for one of our best bets there. But you look at TCU, this is a program just 6-13 against the spread its last 19 games within the league. Under has actually been the order of the day in the last 10 meetings between these two teams, and that goes back to a meeting that predates their current Big 12 rivalry. Last year was actually the first time in the last 10 games between them where the losing team scored more than 16 points. When we look at TCU, Payne, we know they have only one game under their belt, and they look like a significantly different football team in the second half once Max Duggan took over from Matthew Downing. I thought Gary Patterson's comments were pretty interesting when people asked him if you knew Max was going to look like that, how come he didn't start the game? And they were flat out honest, saying, hey, he underwent a lot of testing this offseason, had to get treated for a heart condition, and they weren't sure if his conditioning would allow him to play a full game. Can tell you one thing, if you're Texas and you're preparing for TCU offensively, you got to be a little bit concerned. Tay Barber looks every bit the part of explosive game breaker, and for TCU, hopefully they're able to get their 5-star recruit, the highest ever that they were able to lure to campus, Zach Evans, involved in the offense. But they're going to try and run the ball. They're going to try and take advantage of some of the bubble screens that are out there. How do you see TCU's offense matching up with the Longhorns' defense?
Lure is an interesting describing word there.
I mean, I feel like it's the most politically correct instead of bag of cash. Is this thing live? Is this Mike hot?
He ended up at TCU.
Is this Mike hot?
I would listen. The quarterback situation is interesting. I would expect the majority of snaps to go to Max Duggan, but there is a reason, as you kind of pointed out, that Downing started last week, and it's because he's still trying to get in shape after missing all this time with the heart issue. Gary Patterson, I read, I think the same article, but I found a different quote from it, and it basically he said that he was just going to put him in the second half. He was only going to give him 2 possessions to see how things went, and then Duggan sparked TCU's offense, and all of a sudden he's playing into the fourth quarter. But the other quote from that was Duggan was so gassed in the fourth quarter that his hands were numb. So
that's never a good sign for a guy that's dealing with a heart condition.
Yeah, this was a kid that only got in 10 days of conditioning prior to the Cyclones game. So, it wouldn't shock me if we saw both Duggan and Downing again, but I think you start Duggan, and if he needs rest for a drive or two, fine. But for a guy that missed extended periods of the offseason and was dog-tired, Duggan outperformed Downing in every single way. when you look at how those two guys perform, when both quarterbacks were kept clean, Duggan's adjusted completion percentage was nearly 20% better. Passer rating, 45 points higher than Downing. We know Duggan already has more mobility, so he handled pressure better as well. Duggan actually had a 100% adjusted completion percentage and a 158 passer rating on his pressured dropbacks. Now, I think there's some question marks about TCU's offensive line. They're bringing in some new guys. They're shuffling others around. Gary Patterson has historically done a pretty good job with these makeshift O-lines. And fortunately, I think this is probably a downgrade in terms of the quality of defensive line TCU is facing this week. So there's no excuses. TCU was horrific against Iowa State on early downs last week. They were pretty poor in terms of the pressure they allowed as well. When I look at this, because of the pressure on Matthew Downing and because of the lack of ground game that you mentioned, the Frogs' average distance on third down, 10.4 yards to go. That has to be better this week. I think it starts up front. You mentioned the five-star recruit, Zach Evans. Didn't play last week. He is practicing, though, this week. I think with a talent like that, you probably have to suit him up, give him a few carries, see if there's upside in a game like this where you're an underdog. If he breaks one or two, then you kind of continue to roll the dice with him. I will say this, though. The Longhorns defense doesn't look overly intimidating. And I think, Todd, the one thing we overlooked a little bit when we were coming into this season high on Texas is we probably didn't give enough I think we didn't put enough onus on breaking in two new coordinators in a shortened offseason. Chris Ash is coming in. He's the new Longhorns DC. They had real issues against both the run and pass. Like, when you're looking at Texas Tech, you're like, are these guys going to beat us on the ground? They did a little bit. 4.8 yards a carry, 46% success rate on the ground against Texas. The Longhorns secondary was also a mess. I watched that game. I can't tell you how many times the short pass game was there, especially with these in routes. They were playing so far off. Texas's tackling was horrific. You look at Texas Tech, they had 18 possessions this past week against the Longhorns defense. 22% of those drives were explosive, meaning that Tech averaged over 10 yards per play on the drive. I think Duggan can move the ball here a little bit. I think you want to go tempo. From what I saw, tempo really hurt Texas. But again, I go that route. If you have to give Duggan a little bit of a breather each half for a possession or two, so be it. But I didn't like what I saw when Texas Tech went tempo. The Longhorns defense looked confused. There wasn't a lot of communication on the back end. It kind of says that this new defensive coordinator, Chris Ash, is changing some things that the Longhorns probably aren't necessarily prepared to be running on the back half.
Yeah, and you'd expect that Texas was going to get better given the health in the secondary that they didn't have last year. We know how big a difference that particular trio made for the team in terms of improving their overall defensive profile by nearly a full touchdown a game. On the other side of the ball, Payne, we talked a little bit about Texas and their misleading score. I mean, there wasn't much in the way of big plays or sustained drives. I mean, Texas averaged 4.5 yards per play, which is pretty pedestrian and well below average for elite offenses or even good offenses in college. 7.5 yards per point. I mean, that number's not sustainable either. And Sam Ehlinger only had 2 plays of 25 plus yards in terms of the passing game, despite attempting over 40 passes. When I look at Texas and the way they're going to try and approach the TCU defense, you figure it's going to be with balance, but I'm not sure what to make of Texas and their consistent ability to hit the home run, even with TCU's breakdowns from what we saw in terms of tackling Breece Hall and limiting the big play damage from Iowa State.
I'll be honest. Texas is in my top 10. It's partly there because of you and a couple other guys that I respect. But the Longhorns are a team I struggle with. On paper and through extensive reading and getting information, I always hear about how good Texas is going to be, and they always seem to project out better than what I actually think they are. And, I always hear about all this talent coming in from the state of Texas. You just start to wonder if the high school players are being overrated. We talked about this off air a little bit, that once they commit to the Longhorns, they get that little boost up because I just don't see the gobs of talent that everyone else apparently sees. Sam Ehlinger, really good college football player, but there's a reason he's still playing college football. He doesn't always look fluid or natural. Todd, we had a tiny piece on the team total over 43.5 on Texas this past weekend. So I watched like real large chunks of that game. Texas's offense looks like it's missing Devin Duvernay. Looks like it's missing Colin Johnson. Jake Smith was out. He's supposed to be back this week. Let's see if that helps. But there was this 29-minute stretch in the middle of that game where Texas hung just 3 offensive points. Tom Herman's offense didn't seem to make any adjustments. After the first quarter script wore off, only 3.9 yards per play in the second half. There wasn't much in the way of second half adjustments either. 2.9 yards per play in the third quarter and a 30% success rate. On the day, Tech held Sam Ehlinger and the Longhorns offense to 5.4 yards per play. That's below the national average. I mean, Houston Baptist put up nearly 8 yards per play against Texas Tech's defense. Now, again, maybe I'm being a little too critical here. Another, new offensive coordinator, Mike Yurcik, is coming in. He's lost his 2 top guys at receiver. Maybe it's going to take some time. I don't know. The lone bright spot that I did see was Joshua Moore. He looks like the guy that can be a little bit of a difference maker. He made huge plays against Tech. Sam Ehlinger kind of went to him almost on crucial downs, right? Whether he needed a first down, whether they needed a big play. He was also willing to kind of throw it up to him and go see if he can get the 50-50 ball. He did on that big touchdown. But Sam's going to have to hit some explosive plays against TCU. And you hit this perfectly, and I think if our listeners remember this, anytime we talk TCU the last few seasons, as much as we love and respect Gary Patterson's defense, they can be had by the explosive play. Last year, TCU finished 83rd in explosive play defense, 95th in explosive pass defense. Against Iowa State, Gary Patterson's defense gave up 12 plays of 10 or more yards, 4 plays of 40 or more yards. So, look for that in this game. In addition to the big plays that I think go a long way, obviously, in determining who wins this side of the matchup, so to speak, the 2 units that struggled last week are the Longhorns' O-line and TCU's defensive line. Texas couldn't really establish the point of attack and push around Texas Tech's defensive line, which is pretty shocking to see. There's also, no reason to me how they split the running back carries. Keanu Ingram seems to be the better of the back. He only had 12 carries last week, 7.4 a carry. The distribution of touches looks a little off in my mind. TCU's defensive line struggled. Now, it's only a 1-game sample, but TCU's defensive line looks like it misses Ross Blacklock as well as Blackshear. It's possible the Frogs' D-line is a little down this year. Even if you remove Breece Hall's 75-yarder, he averaged 4.7 a carry on all other runs. TCU couldn't get to Brock Purdy all that often either. Pressured him just on 26% of his dropbacks. So this will be interesting. Let's see which of the struggling units here, whether it's Texas's O-line or TCU's defensive line, wins this battle, Todd.
Yeah, and one thing that I will say came out of that game, you listen to TCU defensive back Trevon Mooring basically saying, hey, look, we have to communicate better in the secondary if we're going to eliminate some of the big plays that were so costly against us. More or less saying, hey, it was our first game. Communication is something that we can improve on as the season goes. And I think when we talk about these teams looking to improve on communication, going on the road in the league, not nearly as daunting when you're playing in front of 11 or 12,000 fans instead of 65 or 70,000 where you have to be a well-oiled machine, especially in adjusting your coverages at the back. From the Big 12 to the SEC, where it's the Alabama Crimson Tide, a 17.5-point favorite, total on the game 51.5 at FanDuel, as they welcome in the Texas A&M Aggies. And when you look at Alabama, they've won 5 out of the last 6 in the series by 18+. They hung 47 points in a 19-point victory a season ago. And while we talked a little bit about Alabama and what we saw from them in the first half, more so than the latter portion of the game in Columbia against Missouri, I think it's a logical place, Payne, to start in this game with Texas A&M, especially on the offensive side. I mean, this is a team that only has one receiver on their roster, Jalen Wittermeyer, that had more than 3 catches entering the season. We've known about the enigmatic inconsistencies from Kellen Mond. And when you look at Alabama, the biggest question mark I think all of us had was with their secondary. It was Patrick Surtain and a bunch of other guys that were going to have to learn to grow up on the fly. Can A&M do enough offensively to put Alabama's defense on its heels? Because we know Jimbo Fisher wants to shorten the game, but the ability to do so is contingent on them running the football and being able to pick up 3 to 4 yards on first down and keep Mond out of those known passing downs where he's typically struggled.
I'm not sure. I have to tell you, I watched the A&M game because we were pretty high on them coming into the season, and I wanted to see how they looked with a lot of guys opting out on that side of the ball. But A&M looked unorganized, and that is putting it nicely. If you are a Florida State fan, it's hard to bash Jimbo because, you got a ring. But organization throughout his time in Florida State was a question mark at times. And I mean, there is footage of Jimbo having like hundreds of loose pieces of paper in his hand, sifting through them to call plays, and pages are blowing across the field. Finally, someone said, like, hey, Jimbo, like, can you graduate to a laminated sheet here? So the organization looked lackluster. And I think if A&M played any other SEC team week 1 instead of Vanderbilt, it's likely a loss. Super sloppy, turned it over on offense, horrific special team gaffes. I mean, A&M turned it over 4 times when you include the 4th and 1 stop. I get the offseason these kids went through. But you have an experienced head coach with a national championship under his belt. You have a senior quarterback. You were hoping things are a little more put together. We talk all the time about hidden yardage. A&M's average starting field position against Vandy was the 23 because of the special teams miscues. Aggies were a net negative 12 yards in average starting field position against Vandy. May not seem like a lot, but for simple math, if each team has 10 possessions, you're down 120 yards right there that you didn't even see. And typically the national average is 13 possessions per game. So turnovers, hidden yardage, that has to be rectified. Those are the things that, it takes to upset Alabama because it's almost impossible to beat them straight. The one thing that you hit on perfectly, and we've given Jimbo a little bit of flack for offensively over the years, is the slow pace, right? When you have the better team, you want to run more plays. A&M ran just 55 offensive snaps against Vandy. Oddly, that may actually benefit them against Alabama. Shorten the game, try and get a little lucky. A&M does need to be more efficient down to have a chance here. 6.8 yards per play last week looks okay, but it's only because A&M hit a few explosive plays. They had a 40% success rate against Vandy's defense. That's not good. Kellen Mond needs to take the next step. He needs to be significantly better because my feeling is when you look at this matchup, Saban and Pete Golding know the key is to stop Spiller, right? Stop A&M's ground game. If you can stop A&M from running, it's actually going to do the inverse. It's going to lengthen this game. It forces Mond and A&M to win through the air, and you hit on this perfectly. I think we probably read the same article. When you look at A&M's passing game, it's without Jamon Osborne, Mond's top receiver who opted out to focus on the draft. Kendrick Rogers and Courtney Davis did the same. Cameron Buckley tore his ACL in camp. Baylor Cupp, an elite tight end, is out for the year again. Wittermeyer, as you alluded to, the only non-running back that came into the 2020 season with more than 3 catches for A&M. So there's not a lot of proven weapons outside. Now, the guys that did get open against Vandy, Mond missed 4 or 5 of those open guys. And, he struggled in other areas that I was surprised to see. For a senior quarterback that's mobile, it's alarming how Mond struggled when he was pressured against Vandy. He had an adjusted completion percentage of 14% when he was pressured. The one thing when I looked that Alabama starters did very well was get after, Sean Robinson, who's pretty mobile. They actually pressured Robinson on 40% of his dropbacks. Alabama created a lot of havoc, a lot of negative plays, 11 of them. If Alabama is able to stop the run and create some negative plays, I think it's too much for Kellen Mond and those receivers to overcome, Todd.
Well, I can tell you that the best recipe as far as a defense when you have questions in the secondary is getting pressure. And if Alabama is able to do that, it's going to help their secondary grow up real fast in a game of this particular magnitude. And you mentioned some of Texas A&M and their inconsistency not being buttoned up by any stretch of the imagination. Not a ringing endorsement when you're playing a true freshman quarterback in Ken Seals for Vanderbilt, who is the third true freshman to start an SEC game, I believe, since 1968 in the season opener. It tells you how rare it truly is. But A&M survive and advances, and we saw Texas Tech survive and advance against Houston Baptist before following it up the next week with a great performance against the rival. The big question I have here isn't necessarily even Texas A&M offensively against Alabama's defense. It's what Texas A&M can do on the defensive side of the ball to slow down this Alabama passing attack if Mac Jones has time. When you look at Mac Jones, strong season debut, workmanlike, 18 of 24, 2 touchdown passes. Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith, we know, are a very formidable 1-2 punch in the receiving core. And you mentioned defections for A&M. Well, I mean, this is a team that was already thin at defensive back. Elijah Blades opts out. On top of that, Mike Elko's defense is designed to take down teams that want to run the ball as opposed to spread the field in the passing game, which would have been great if they were playing Alabama 5-6 years ago. A little bit different now when you take on the Crimson Tide that are more comfortable throwing it all over the yard. Does A&M have enough on that side of the ball to slow down Alabama's high-powered attack?
I'm not quite sure. And if you listen to last week's podcast, obviously I'm a big fan of Mac Jones. I thought he performed well against Missouri. This guy isn't just some like game manager. And you read a lot of the national narrative and they think that he basically is that. And I just don't get it, man. Like, he was accurate. He pushed the ball down the field. He connected on 3 of his 5 deep balls for a touchdown. Now, the O-line did a great job making his life easy. I think he was only pressured twice the entire game against Missouri, but he completed both those balls. One went for a touchdown when he was pressured. It was probably his best throw of the game, getting hit in the face. The one area that wasn't great for Bama's offense that A&M is going to have to win as well is first down. Alabama had just a 29% success rate on first down. Their average yards to go on third down was 8.1 yards. That's not a number you love to see. Fortunately, that's when Mac was really good. Bama had a 65% success rate on third downs, hit some really nice explosives on third down as well. But when you're going to step up in competition, I think you have to be better on first down in those early downs. I really think that's probably, got to be the focus here when it comes to, down-to-down success. You kind of hit on this. I know the Aggies defense was good last week. They get the big stop late. They hold Vandy to 3.8 yards per play. But I don't really expect much from Vandy's offense. You mentioned the true freshman quarterback. Even last year, 104th in offensive efficiency. So not much has changed there. I didn't take a lot away from A&M's defense. Part of the reason we really liked A&M before all the opt-outs was because they're returning, a lot of guys offensively. They had a ton of guys coming back on the defensive side of the ball. They were returning, 75% of the defensive production. We love Mike Elko. But, in saying that, the one area where those returning defenders struggled last season was against the run. They're going to have to be able to stop the run here as well. A&M last year, 57th in the country in rushing success rate defense in 2019, 81st in explosive run defense. In terms of power success rate, which is this measure of how often you can stop runs on third and fourth down with 2 or less yards to go, A&M was 107th in the country. So I find it difficult to believe that in a shortened offseason where a lot of these guys couldn't be around the facility to strength train and get proper meals in the system, that they're suddenly, going to be this like brute force up front. So that's one thing I think we also have to watch for. You mentioned their issues potentially in the secondary, but I just think this might be a little different in the trenches as well. This is a different fight in a different weight class than what they endured last week. The way Mac Jones is playing right now, if he is not faced with third and longs because A&M isn't shutting down that ground game on first, it's going to be a really long day. I think the glimmer of hope is, and it's only a 60-minute sample size, that Bama's, wasn't as dominant running as I thought they might be against Missouri. And that's kind of the one glimmer of hope here. I think, Elko's probably got to figure out, hey, let's see if I can stop the run with my front 7 or my front 4 and put more guys in coverage. Because if you back out, quarterback runs and receiver runs and just gauge handoffs to running backs, Alabama only averaged 3.9 yards a carry. So when I look at this, first down is going to be the absolute deciding factor on this side of the ball. A&M also needs to limit the big play. Even dominating Vandy last week, A&M gave up 10 plays of 10 or more yards. You can't let Jalen Waddle and Devontae Smith kind of chunk and explosive you to death, but it really is about first down here. And I think, if A&M, and you're going to know pretty damn early, if A&M can stop the run without committing extra guys to the box, they're probably going to stay within this number. If not, this could get ugly, as you alluded to. Saban doesn't seem minding to put it up on his old boy Jimbo there.
No, that is for sure. He's more than happy to try and make a statement whenever he can. When you look at this number, we haven't seen a whole heck of a lot of movement On the side, you did see a little bit of support for the under early on. Payne, what have you seen in regards to some of the line movement thus far, albeit the number's only been up on the board for about 72 hours?
Yeah, I'm not sure where this game ultimately closes. And typically, if you are taking a dog, it's not a bad thing to have a guy like Jimbo on your side that loves to shorten games. And he always tends to be adamant about the scoreboard looking better than what happens on the field. We saw last year in the Clemson game, some of those late drives for A&M are played like it's the final drive of the Super Bowl to get in the back door. Jimbo's no dummy, right? Appearances matter. Making boosters who bet these games happy matters, especially right now. And so, you mentioned Saban covering the number against Jimbo, but they are from the same coaching tree. We saw Saban does like to play his younger guys late in these games for multiple reasons, right? You can get young guys some snaps, it's great, but you can also muddy some things up, and Saban's always looking for some added motivation. And I'd also put some junk on film for your opponent and muddies up some of the metrics, and I think smart coaches are doing that now. Belichick does it. Saban does it. So, those are the kind of things that I'm not sure where this settles. Obviously, public's going to be all over Alabama here. I did see some money on the, off the screen on Texas A&M, so it didn't have an impact on where this goes. My feeling is you're going to want to wait a little bit here, right? I think you could probably get the hook on 17 if A&M ultimately was the side you decided to land on.
Makes a ton of sense. Probably not a game that'll make my dance card, but one that I'll be watching for sure amid the slate, trying to figure out what A&M can be if they're able to take the next step, or if the Alabama juggernaut will continue to roll down the tracks. Now, I think this is the marquee game of the day, though, especially in the SEC when you have the intersectional showdown between the East and West, teams that play every single season and have, I believe, for as long as the conference has been in existence. It's the Georgia Bulldogs, typically a game we see in November, not this early in the calendar, welcoming in the Auburn Tigers. And Georgia, a 6.5-point favorite at FanDuel, the total 44.5 there as well. When you look at Georgia, Payne, they've been favored in the last 3 meetings between these two proud programs and covered all of them. 5 of the last 6 meetings have gone under the total, 8 out of the last 10. Auburn hasn't scored more than 14 points in any of the last 3 meetings, so I guess that gives us the perfect opportunity to go, what did we learn about Auburn week 1 in a game where they lost the yardage battle, they were out first down, they lost time of possession. We know the ground game struggled, we mentioned that at the top of the show. The passing game averaged more than 8 yards per play, but we worry about Bo Nix's accuracy and a concern. And they were also the beneficiary of +3 turnovers. Auburn offensively matched up against Georgia's defense. Chad Morris, hey, look, if last week was the pre-test, you better be ready for the final exam.
I do think we started to see Chad Morris's impact on Bo Nix in the Auburn offense. If that's the starting point without a normal offseason, you have to be really excited with the potential. Especially moving forward with that receiver group. Seth Williams is a monster. Stove looks healthy again. Schwartz is a speed demon. And it was against a veteran Kentucky defense. But, you look, Bo Nix and Auburn were good enough on early downs that their average distance to go on third down wasn't that much to overcome, only 6.7 yards to go on third down. It made Bo Nix's life pretty easy. There also wasn't, to your point, and this is something that I really wanted to monitor because it was an issue last year, there wasn't a lot of erratic throws from Nix. His ball placement and accuracy was better than the last time I saw him. Even the simple things, Todd, like those bubble screens that are a staple of Malzahn's offense, they were at least keeping receivers in stride. They didn't have to turn around or stop to catch it. The accuracy did look a little bit better. When Nix was under pressure and had a clean pocket to throw from, he was pretty good as well. Had an adjusted completion percentage of 81% from a clean pocket. Also completed 4 of his 5 deep passes, had a 158 passer rating on those. This week, though, is, a different animal against Georgia's defense. I think if you asked Malzahn and Chad Morris in confidence if they would rather have this Georgia game later in the season, they would say absolutely yes. Okay? So you have Dan Lanning, you have Kirby Smart's defense. It's probably the best in the country. This could be one of the toughest tests any offense could possibly have, so I'm not expecting much from Auburn's offense this year. As good as things were last week, I think there's still some holes. There's still some issues for the Tigers' offense. Their offensive line struggled to get a push in the ground game. The running backs are a bit of a question mark. You can tell based on snap counts that Malzahn and Chad Morris treated the Kentucky game a little bit like a spring scrimmage. They're searching still for the 5 best offensive linemen. If you look at left tackle, left guard, and right guard, 2 players played at least 19 snaps at each of those 3 positions. Left tackle is a little bit of a problem. Alec Jackson is a converted defensive lineman attempting to make the move to left tackle. He gave up 2 pressures and 2 penalties on only 38 snaps, then they yanked them. So there is some issues there with Auburn's offensive line in the ground game. If you're Kirby Smart, though, and Dan Lanning, your defensive line has to dominate this game. It's likely that you're going to be able to stop Auburn's ground game with minimal effort here. But the one thing that we've criticized Georgia's defense about over the last couple years, and more so me, and these are just things that I kind of try to dig into when, when the national narrative is like so high, I want to see if it's reality, because that's typically when you find the most value. But the one thing that always I've struggled with in regards to Georgia's defense the last few seasons is their inability to play on the other side of the line of scrimmage. The havoc and the negative plays, they just haven't been there when you think about the talent on Georgia's defense. And you look last season, Georgia's defense finished 74th in havoc rate. Whether it was standard downs or passing downs, Georgia was 60th or worst in adjusted sack rate. Those things have to change, right? Like, if this defense is going to be truly elite, it has to change. And for this week, you have to pressure Bo Nix. Even with a good performance last week, Bo Nix was terrible when Kentucky actually got to him. 39 passer rating, completed only 20% of his throws when the heat was on. So you have to be able to figure out how to pressure Bo Nix here. And I think this is interesting. You start to wonder if it's Georgia's, scheme a little bit here. We know Kirby Smart is a defensive-minded guy. He's a little conservative when it comes to his offense, but him and Dan Lanning might be too conservative defensively as well, right? Not letting guys play downhill, not sending enough pressure to cause disruption. And I get it. Kirby doesn't want to give up the big play. He wants to keep everything in front. He's not sure if he does give up the big play, if the offense is going to be able to get back out on the field and score quick enough. But you have to do it here. And I get it. Fans are super happy with the defense. They did a great job limiting Arkansas. The success rate has to be really good if you're not going to create these negative plays. Arkansas was held to a 29% success rate in the opener. It was the lowest explosive rate in the SEC last week that they held Arkansas's offense to. But they only caused 6 negative plays all game. Only pressured Felipe Franks on 33% of his dropbacks. Georgia's defense, I think, has to be the tool that's used to help the offense operate on short fields. It looks like that, could be needed in a game like this when you look at the total of 45. Scoring could be at a premium here. If the defense can take that next step up to where they're creating negative plays, so when, Auburn does ultimately punt, it's a shorter field for the offense. That, to me, is what's missing still from Georgia's defense, Todd.
Well, one thing that Georgia's going to have to do is they'll have to neutralize at least what Auburn has threats-wise on the perimeter. As we know, Williams, Stove, and Schwartz combined for 13 catches, 200-plus yards, and 3 touchdowns in Auburn's win against Kentucky. And I think it's always important when you talk about a Georgia football game and you talk about offense and what they do to contain their opposition, what you're going to get from Georgia on their offensive side of the ball. We saw the Georgia offense look absolutely pathetic in the first half against Arkansas, begin to get some of their swagger back in the second half, after Kirby elected to make a change going from DeJuan Mathis to Stetson Bennett. Stetson, of course, a walk-on that had left Georgia, had come back. Kirby was a little bit reluctant to pin a lot of that responsibility on Mathis. I think some of that's by design. You have to imagine that he's going to find a place in this Georgia offense going forward. But ultimately, Payne, you mentioned it, a low total. You're laying nearly a touchdown here with the Georgia Bulldogs. Do you have enough confidence in what they're able to do offensively that gives you some breathing room if you're laying this kind of number, given the fact that we really didn't see a whole lot of punch from Georgia, especially on the ground from James Cook and Zamir White, 2 guys that were expected to kind of follow in the long-standing lineage of great Georgia running backs?
So let's start at the quarterback position. We know JT Daniels was medically cleared. I think everyone just assumes that means he's getting thrown in the fire and starting. You go to all these Georgia blogs, and they're just pounding the table for JT Daniels to start. But Monday, Kirby Smart came out and said, I don't know how much this changes the quarterback picture. JT has to be able to show us he can function efficiently and that his knee can hold up. Regardless of whoever ends up starting, I think Georgia is smart not to name a starter publicly. Make Kevin Steele and Auburn prepare for 3 quarterbacks who are all wildly different. If I'm Kirby, I'm starting Stetson Bennett. But I'm also going to have a DeJuan Mathis involved in this game in short yardage and goal line packages, use his legs, provide another wrinkle to an offense that could use all the help it can get. Again, I know the entire Georgia fan base wants JT Daniels to start immediately, but I'm not sure that's the right move. It's a nice insurance policy Saturday if he's needed, and for future games, obviously, maybe that's your hope that he is your starter. But let's not forget, Todd, and I know you're close to the USC program, the last time we saw JT Daniels, he wasn't very good pre-injury.
Absolutely not. Everyone makes him sound like he's the saving grace and the Messiah coming to Georgia. It tells you how little Pac-12 football SEC fans watch.
Not outside the SEC, that's for sure. Probably not up that late. JT Daniels' numbers against defenses comparable to that of the SEC, you start to look and find and dig into the Utahs and the Cals. That's the closest the Pac-12 has to SEC defenses. In JT Daniels' 2 starts against Utah and Cal, he only completed 54% of his passes for 5.3 yards per pass attempt and 3 picks. Against Cal, Daniels didn't lead his team to a single point scored the final 2.5 quarters. Daniels was benched for Matt Fink against Utah. So I'm not sure what we're going to see here from a guy that was literally just cleared days ago, hasn't taken a hit, and hasn't had the full amount of snaps either. If you parse out some of the metrics from Georgia's win over Arkansas and only include the plays with Stetson Bennett, the guy that I think should get the start, he was actually decent. Georgia's offense was pretty good. They had a 50% success rate with Bennett operating things. If you look at EPA per snap and explosiveness, Georgia's offense with Stetson Bennett was substantially better. I obviously could be proven wrong, right, over this meaningless 60-minute sample size here. But I think, there's some opportunities if Stetson Bennett gets the start. When you look at how Kevin Steele's, offense, or defense rather, was built. If Stetson Bennett is starting, it makes more sense based upon who they're playing as well. Having a better pocket passer against a defense that hasn't shown it can get pressure, in my mind, means we don't need to worry about mobility as much with your quarterback. And we saw last season, Auburn's finished 91st in passing down sack rate. That was with 3 pros along the defensive line. Against Kentucky, Auburn's defense only recorded a 23% pressure rate. So the excuse that we might want to start Mathis because of his mobility, I don't really know if that lends itself here. I think Stetson Bennett probably better matchup against Kevin Steele's defense. When you look at how Georgia's offense is built, this is shocking because it's an area that we thought was bad the last few years, but receiver may actually be the strength this year. So again, having Stetson Bennett in there as the true passer also makes sense in this direction. I think there's some uncertainty, though, with Georgia's offensive line creating push in the ground game. You mentioned that. They didn't really move Arkansas around that much. Zamir White got going, late, but I think he and James Cook needs to be a little bit better. They've been disappointing so far. Cook, that's my guy, but, hasn't really shown the ability to break off these long runs. We know he's really speedy, hasn't been overly elusive. But Todd, this is a matchup that we saw late last season in November. It was an absolute grinder. Both offenses averaged less than 3.9 yards per play. Georgia did just enough to hold on, but their offense had a 0% success rate in the fourth quarter in the last meeting. This was only 4 or 5 games ago that these two teams played each other. So this bodes well for another rock fight. The total is low. You can get 45 still. The only fear I have with that, and we talked off air a little bit, when I looked at the metrics, if Stetson Bennett gets the start, Georgia's offense used an increased amount of tempo and pace when he was the quarterback compared to Mathis. If Mathis gets the start, I think we're looking at potentially having a few shekels on this under, whether it's the first half or full game. If it's Stetson Bennett, then I'm a little more reluctant to do that, because if we see that increased pace, it makes me a little nervous.
Well, I'm not sure I'd be running to the window to back Georgia as a favorite with Mathis under center until you saw a little bit more consistency. Don't get me wrong, Stetson Bennett isn't the next in a long line of great Georgia quarterbacks that's going to have us comparing him to Matthew Stafford by any stretch of the imagination, but he at least provides a viable threat throwing the football. So it'll be interesting to see how Georgia elects to craft a game plan. and more importantly, how Auburn looks in their second game offensively under Chad Morris's leadership.
He's the college quarterback, though, right? He's like the underdog. He doesn't have the size or the arm strength, so he's never been the starter, so to speak. But he knows where the ball needs to go. He's accurate. He's got enough zip on it. He has command of the offense. And you had heard when he was running like scout team against Georgia's defenses in the past, all the defensive coordinators like, this dude's a beast. He just doesn't have the measurables, so he's constantly been overlooked. But I think he's accurate enough. I think he can run the offense, and I think he probably gives Georgia the best chance here on Saturday.
There's no doubt about that, and this is a guy who left the Georgia program only to come back. I imagine he'll relish the opportunity to hang on to the starting role as long as he's able to earn it, and Kirby Smart and that Georgia offense will entrust him with those responsibilities. 4 big games broken down as in-depth and as eloquently as we possibly can here around the Bet the Board home offices. You, of course, can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Fuhrman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, though, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod, and be sure to download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. You can track all of your lines on all of your favorite games. Plenty of wagering options available. Full game, first half props, you name it. FanDuel gives you more ways to win. But Payne, before we close up shop and we get out of Dodge as far as the college football slate is concerned, and we flip the page to the National Football League, we do have one final order of business to transact.
Let's go off the beaten path here, Todd. Rotation number 129. Let's go with Arkansas State minus the 3. What do you think about that?
Going with the heavy hitters, huh? We're digging into the Sun Belt to try and give out our best bet. You know what? When you look at this game, Payne, I think there's no question of these two teams who's played the better strength of schedule. Coastal, of course, got the big win the first time we saw them in primetime, so to speak, with their win against Kansas. But you watch Kansas last week against Baylor, and all of a sudden, you go, this Jayhawks offense has a boatload of problems. And then, of course, you see Coastal follow it up with a win against Campbell, one where they didn't cover and still found a way to give up 20 points. Meanwhile, Ark State, yes, they haven't played in weeks, but you're talking about playing a good Memphis team that's got a veteran quarterback who they showed their mettle getting inside the number, and then all of a sudden that win against Kansas State looks a heck of a lot better when you consider what Kansas State has done. The only concern I have with Arkansas State, they haven't played a football game in 3 weeks, but it looks like, you know, as far as the COVID situation, it was a team that I think both of us were intent to bet on last weekend against Tulsa and still might be a little bit undervalued in the market.
Absolutely agree. And this line's taken a little bit of a movement, and looks like the goal here was to get this as low as humanly possible. Lay the 2.5, lay the 3 was the initial I think intent of this position. So I'm happy with Arkansas State here. This is a battle of the Sun Belt. I believe Arkansas State's the better team. Looking at home field numbers in our metrics, like this is the lowest that we have given home field advantage in college football as long as I've been doing this, obviously. So I don't really think there's going to be a home field advantage here. I think Arkansas State was a team that we projected to be better than Coastal because of those deficiencies you mentioned from the Chanticleers on defense. So let's go with Arkansas State, rotation number 129. Get out ahead, lay the 3 here. Obviously a key number.
An advance warning for our listeners who are inevitably going to try and find this game when they tune in. Do not adjust your computer, your monitors, your cell phones, or your TV sets. You will see this game taking place on a teal field in lovely Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. So let's hope the
on the old Deuce.
Is it on ESPN too?
That's what it's saying.
Look at that. The Sun Belt getting proud billing. Well, we'll know at least where we stand in the early afternoon. So Arkansas State, the second college football best bet, laying 3 with the Red Wolves. And I know we've run a little bit longer than anticipated. Payne, any final words of wisdom, thoughts, rants about Mike Norvell and the current state of the Florida State Seminole program, or we'll save that for later on in the season?
We'll save that for later in case they get beat this weekend by Jackson State. Back tomorrow with the NFL.
Always a pleasure. College football, best of luck to you, our loyal listeners, week whatever the hell we're calling it in college football. And come Saturday afternoon with an Arkansas State ticket in hand, we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.